The knock came just after sunset, soft but steady, echoing through the narrow hallway of Daniel Carter's small apartment. He rubbed his tired eyes, the weight of a double shift still clinging to his shoulders, and opened the door. On the other side stood a girl, no older than 20. Her suitcase was scuffed, the kind that had seen too many buses and sidewalks. Her clothes were plain, worn at the edges. She smiled, polite but nervous, shifting her weight as if unsure she belonged here at all. Daniel's eyes narrowed instinctively, not with cruelty but with caution. He had a daughter to protect, a fragile piece to guard. To him, she was just another student renting a room to make ends meet. Nothing more. "Lila, right?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes, thank you for letting me stay." The air between them carried the weight of unspoken assumptions. The building Daniel lived in wasn't grand. Faded brick walls, a stairwell that carried the smell of cooking from every floor, and neighbors whose voices always carried further than their doors. Privacy was a fragile thing here, and secrets, once caught, were easily carried by whispers. By the second morning of Lila's arrival, those whispers had begun. "She looks too young to be living alone," one woman muttered in the laundry room, folding shirts with sharp, precise hands. "She doesn't look like she can pay much rent," another added, her eyes darting to the ceiling where Daniel's apartment Saturday, and with Daniel raising that little girl of his, he ought to be careful. The tone wasn't openly cruel, but it carried something heavier, suspicion. In places like this, suspicion traveled faster than kindness. Daniel overheard them as he waited for his clothes to finish in the machine. He didn't respond, only pressed his lips into a thin line and turned away. He had grown used to judgment. Neighbors questioning his parenting, whispering about how a man alone couldn't raise a child properly. But now, it seemed, their doubt had shifted to the quiet girl renting his spare room. Lila noticed it too. She felt eyes on her when she carried groceries up the stairs, or when she walked Emma to school. People glanced at her clothes, her silence, her unassuming presence. They drew conclusions without asking questions. At the grocery store, the sting of it deepened. It was a small market, crowded with baskets and fluorescent lights. Lila placed a loaf of bread, some fruit, and a carton of milk on the counter. When she reached into her bag, she pulled out coins, carefully counted, stacked with care. The cashier, a young man with tired eyes, sighed audibly. "Seriously? All coins?" His voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough for the woman behind Lila to hear. The woman rolled her eyes, muttering under her breath, "Probably all she has." Lila flushed. Her fingers trembled as she pushed the coins forward. She wasn't embarrassed by the money itself, but by the assumption, the way people thought scarcity defined worth. The cashier shoved the bag toward her without a thank you. The woman behind her tapped her foot impatiently. For a moment, Lila wanted to explain, to say she had bills far larger than coins tucked away in an account her classmates couldn't even imagine. But what would that prove? To reveal herself would only feed the very judgment she was trying to escape. So she lowered her eyes and left quietly. Outside, Daniel was waiting with Emma, who had been skipping stones near the curb. He noticed the redness in Lila's cheeks, the way she clutched the grocery bag too tightly. He didn't ask, though he could guess. He had seen enough of the world to recognize that look, the sting of being measured and found wanting. Emma tugged at Lila's hand. "Did you get the strawberries?" "Yes," Lila said, forcing a small smile. She reached into the bag, pulling them out. Emma grinned and held them like treasure. Daniel caught the smile that Lila gave his daughter. It was soft, genuine, untouched by the bitterness she just faced. And yet, he stayed silent. A part of him wanted to step in, to say something when people treated her that way. Another part reminded him of the delicate balance he lived in. Too many battles at once could tear apart the fragile stability he was trying to hold. So he walked beside her, carrying the heavier bag without a word. Back in the apartment, Lila retreated to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed, the muted hum of the city beyond the window. She thought about how people judged what they saw. A simple girl with worn shoes and coins in her pocket. They never thought to look deeper. And maybe that was what she wanted. To see if kindness existed when no name, no fortune, no reputation stood behind her. Down the hall, Daniel poured himself a cup of coffee, the bitterness of the roast clinging to his tongue. He thought about the whispers, the looks, the cashier's tone. He didn't defend her, not yet, but he noticed. And noticing sometimes was the first quiet step toward change. The nights were always the hardest for Daniel Carter. When Emma finally fell asleep, her small breath steady, her hand curled around the stuffed rabbit that had long since lost one ear, the silence of the apartment closed in. For most people, silence meant rest. For Daniel, it meant numbers. Numbers on bills stacked on the kitchen counter. Numbers on overdue notices shoved into drawers. Numbers he scrawled on the back of receipts, trying to stretch a paycheck across rent, groceries, and the endless list of things a growing child seemed to need. He had not always lived this way. Once, there had been 2 paychecks, 2 pairs of shoulders to carry the weight. His wife, Sarah, had been laughter in the kitchen and calm at the end of storms. But illness came quickly and took more quickly still. By the time doctors gave the words a name, she was already slipping away. Daniel remembered those hospital nights vividly. Emma, only 5, asleep on his chest in a stiff waiting room chair, while machines beeped on the other side of a door he wasn't allowed to open. He remembered promising Sarah, though she was too weak to answer, that he would protect their daughter, that Emma would never feel abandoned. He had kept that promise with everything in him, but keeping it came at a cost. By day, Daniel worked maintenance at a local school, fixing leaky faucets and squeaky doors. By night, he hauled boxes in a warehouse, the kind of work that left his back sore and his hands raw. Between shifts, he tried to be both mother and father, packing lunches, braiding hair with clumsy fingers, listening to Emma's stories about classmates and playground politics. Exhaustion lived in his bones, but pride lived in his heart. Emma never went to bed hungry. She never missed a school trip. He made sure of it. Still, the apartment told the truth he tried to hide. Peeling paint on the walls, a refrigerator that hummed too loudly, a spare room that had sat empty for months because Daniel had resisted the thought of a stranger living under the same roof as his daughter. But the bills pressed harder each week. The school announced a fee increase. Winter clothes needed buying. And Emma, bright-eyed and curious, had begun asking about piano lessons after seeing a friend play at school. Daniel wanted to say yes. He wanted to give her the world. But the numbers said no. So he made the choice he had resisted. He placed an ad, carefully worded, for a room to rent. He told himself it was temporary, just until he could get ahead, just until one of the jobs gave him enough hours to make up the gap. When Lila answered, he almost said no. She looked so young, so uncertain, standing in the doorway that first evening. The thought of Emma and a stranger under the same roof twisted his chest. But her voice was soft, polite. There was something in her eyes, not weakness, but restraint. A quiet strength that reminded him of Sarah in her earliest days. Still, he kept his distance. He told himself, protect Emma first. Always. The neighbor's whispers only hardened that resolve. A girl like that, living with a single man and his daughter? People will talk. As if they weren't already talking. As if judgment wasn't as common as air in these narrow hallways. But Daniel knew something the neighbors didn't. He knew what it felt like to be misjudged. To be seen only through the narrow lens of circumstance. People thought of him as the struggling widower, the man barely keeping things together. They didn't see the pride behind the exhaustion. They didn't see the fierce joy in watching Emma grow, or the way he carried Sarah's memory in every choice he made. So when he looked at Lila, he didn't just see a tenant. He saw someone standing at the edge of that same divide, judged by appearances, carrying secrets unspoken. He didn't know what they were, and he wasn't sure he wanted to. But he knew this, he needed the rent, and she needed a place where the world might, at least for a while, leave her in peace. And so he let her in, not just into the spare room, but into the fragile rhythm of his life. A rhythm built on duty, love, and the quiet determination of a man who feared only one thing: failing the child who looked up at him with trust unshaken. At night, When Emma's small hand found his as they walked home from school, Daniel felt the weight of that promise he had once made in a hospital room. He could carry exhaustion. He could carry debt. But he could never allow himself to carry regret. That was his burden. And it was one he would carry alone, or so he thought. When the apartment quieted, when Daniel's footsteps faded into sleep and Emma's soft snores hummed through the walls, Lila opened the drawer of the small desk in her rented room. From it, she pulled a leather-bound notebook, its corners worn, its pages thick with ink. She uncapped her pen slowly, as if the act itself needed ceremony. Then she wrote, "Another day unnoticed. Another day ordinary. I think I like it this way." Her handwriting was neat, careful, but beneath the precision lived a tension. Words pressed harder into the page than they should, as if each one bore the weight of something unspoken. Lila's gaze drifted to the window. Beyond the glass stretched the glow of street lamps, the laughter of neighbors drifting in from the sidewalk. She smiled faintly. It was a world of chipped paint and narrow budgets, yet it felt more alive than the one she had left behind. The world she had left was polished, immaculate. A mansion perched high above the city, where windows stretched floor to ceiling and marble floors echoed with the silence of wealth. Lila had grown up surrounded by chandeliers, chauffeurs, and guards at every door. But what she remembered most was not luxury. It was the coldness. Her father's voice in the boardroom, clipped, decisive, commanding an empire with a flick of his hand. His schedule was a list of meetings and mergers, his gaze more often fixed on quarterly reports than on her face. To the world, he was power incarnate. To her, he was absence disguised as authority. She remembered sitting at long dining tables where the distance between them was more than physical. She had wanted to tell him about her art, her notebooks, her longing for something simpler, but the words always withered under the weight of his silence. So she left, not with fanfare, not with scandal. She slipped away quietly, trading designer luggage for a weathered suitcase, trading chauffeured cars for buses that rattled through neighborhoods no one in her old world would enter. Here, she was not Lila Harrington, the billionaire's daughter whispered about in business magazines. Here, she was simply Lila, a student renting a room, counting coins at grocery stores, walking beside a widower's child. And for once, she could measure the world not by how it looked in headlines, but by how it felt in her chest. Still, cracks showed in her disguise. When Daniel's daughter tugged her hand, Lila felt a warmth that startled her, a longing she had buried. When Daniel carried her grocery bag without speaking, she felt a flicker of respect she wasn't accustomed to from men her father's age. In her notebook, she confessed the truth she dared not speak aloud. "Sometimes I fear they will find out. Not the neighbors, they would only gossip louder. But Daniel, if he looks too closely, he'll see I am not what I seem. I don't want him to see money. I want him to see me." She closed the book, pressing her palm against the cover as if to silence it. Her disguise held for now. Plain clothes, quiet presence, the patience to endure suspicion. But beneath it all, her heart beat against the mask she had chosen. And in the stillness of that rented room, it was clear. She wasn't hiding because she was weak. She was hiding because she wanted to be free. The school cafeteria smelled faintly of disinfectant and yesterday's pizza. Plastic trays clattered against tables. Children's voices rose and fell like waves. And parents trickled in for the monthly family lunch day. Daniel sat at the edge of a long table, Emma beside him, swinging her legs as she unwrapped the sandwich he had made that morning. She was smiling, her hair tied back with a ribbon Lila had given her. Daniel noticed, though he said nothing. Across the room, a cluster of mothers gathered near the vending machines, their voices low but not low enough. "I heard he's renting his spare room out," one said, smoothing her blouse as though the very idea of Daniel's situation wrinkled her. "To some college girl. Can you imagine? A single father, with a daughter, and a stranger living under the same roof." The others leaned in. One whispered, "Doesn't sound safe. For Emma, I mean, you never know what kind of people end up in those situations." Another added with a smirk, "I saw the girl at the grocery store, paying with coins. If she can't even afford proper groceries, what's she doing in his house? The words pricked the air, sharp as pins. Daniel, who had been close enough to hear, kept his eyes fixed on Emma's lunchbox. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He had lived long enough to know that defending himself only fed the fire of gossip. Still, the restraint cost him. What none of them noticed was that Lila stood just a few steps away. She had offered to drop off Emma's forgotten homework folder that afternoon, and had arrived just in time to hear her name tangled in their whispers. The sting was immediate, not because they doubted her wealth, she had buried that truth willingly, but because they doubted her character. To be reduced to coins, to suspicion, to whispered warnings. It was the same kind of cold judgment she had run from in her father's world. Only this time, it cut deeper, because she had hoped this place would be different. She pressed the folder tighter against her chest and turned to leave quietly, but Emma's voice stopped her. "Lila!" The little girl waved from the table, smiling brightly. "You brought it." Daniel looked up, startled. He hadn't expected her. For a moment, his expression flickered, gratitude laced with hesitation. Lila walked over, placing the folder on the table. "You almost forgot this," she said softly to Emma. Emma beamed. "Thank you. You saved me from getting in trouble." Daniel cleared his throat. "You didn't have to go out of your way. It was on the counter," Lila replied. "I was on my way past the school anyway." The air between them was taut, gratitude on one side, caution on the other. Emma, oblivious, tugged at Lila's sleeve. "Will you help me with my math later? Daddy doesn't like fractions." Daniel shifted, uncomfortable. "Emma," Lila smiled, bending closer. "Only if it's okay with your dad." Emma turned her wide eyes on him, pleading. Daniel hesitated. He thought of the mother's whispers echoing across the cafeteria. He thought of responsibility, of boundaries, of the fragile line between protector and provider. Finally, he said gently, "Not today, sweetheart. Maybe another time." Emma's shoulders slumped, but she nodded. Lila only offered a small smile, accepting the quiet rejection without protest. She had grown used to barriers, after all. The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch. Children scrambled, parents gathered their things. Daniel rose, taking Emma's hand. As they walked toward the exit, he noticed the mothers watching him, watching Lila, too. Their eyes weren't kind. Outside, the sunlight was sharp, almost unforgiving. Lila paused at the curb, her voice low but steady. "They don't know you, Daniel. And they don't know me." He looked at her, surprised. He hadn't expected her to speak. Her gaze held his, not defiant, but clear, almost gentle. For the first time, he glimpsed the steel beneath her quiet exterior. "People will always talk," he muttered. "I've learned to live with it." Lila tilted her head, the faintest trace of sadness in her smile. "Maybe, but that doesn't make it right." For a heartbeat, silence stretched between them, unspoken truths, unasked questions. Then Emma tugged Daniel's hand, breaking the spell. "Daddy, can we walk home with Lila?" she asked. Daniel hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. The three of them walked side by side, Emma skipping between them, unaware of the storm that swirled in the adult world above her. For Lila, the whispers in the cafeteria still echoed, but so did Emma's trustful smile. And in that fragile balance, she found a reason to stay, even when the world seemed intent on pushing her away. The storm began with a low growl against the horizon, the kind of warning rumble that makes windows tremble in their frames. By the time night fully set, the rain lashed against Daniel's small apartment like 1,000 impatient fists. The lights flickered once, then surrendered, leaving the home in shadow. Emma whimpered from her bedroom doorway, clutching her stuffed rabbit. "Daddy!" Her voice was thin against the booming thunder, but Daniel wasn't there. He had called earlier, his voice apologetic through the static of bad reception. Overtime ran long. "Stay inside. I'll be home soon." That left Emma with Lila. The girl lit a single candle, its flame small but steady. She pulled Emma into the living room and draped a blanket over her shoulders. The room filled with the sound of rain hammering the glass, punctuated by cracks of thunder. Emma buried her face into the fabric. I don't like storms. Lila's expression softened. She lowered herself to the floor, eye level with the trembling child. Do you know what storms are? She whispered. They're just the sky having a conversation. Loud, clumsy, sometimes frightening, but it always passes. Emma peeked out, her eyes wide. Really? Really? Lila smiled, and then pulled her leather notebook from her bag. With a pencil, she began sketching, quick strokes that came alive under the flickering candlelight. Look, she said, turning the page toward Emma. A rough drawing of a cloud shaped like a dragon filled the paper, lightning flashing from its mouth. Emma gasped. It looks like it's protecting the city. Exactly, Lila nodded. Even storms can guard us. Sometimes noise is just another way of saying, I'm here. Slowly, Emma's shoulders relaxed. She crawled closer, snuggling against Lila's side as the girl kept sketching. A tower rising from rain, a rabbit clutching an umbrella, a little girl holding hands with a faceless figure who shielded her. The apartment door creaked open just then, wind sweeping in as Daniel stumbled inside. He was drenched, rain dripping from his jacket, hair plastered against his forehead. He stopped in the doorway, frozen. By candlelight, the sight before him looked almost like a painting. Emma curled against Lila's arm, the girl leaning gently, whispering stories into her ear while their faces glowed in soft amber light. The storm outside was wild, but in that circle of warmth, it seemed distant, muted. For the first time, Daniel didn't see a stranger on his couch. He saw his daughter safe, comforted, laughing in little bursts that hadn't filled the house for weeks. He swallowed hard, emotion rising against his will. Lila glanced up, catching his gaze. For a brief second, her guard slipped. There was no trace of the quiet tenant who kept her head down. In her eyes, Daniel glimpsed something steady, something strong, like she had weathered storms much greater than this one. He looked away quickly, clearing his throat. Emma, he said softly. Time for bed. Emma groaned but obeyed, kissing Lila's cheek before scurrying off with her stuffed rabbit. Daniel watched her go, then lingered by the door, dripping rain onto the floor. Thank you, he muttered, his voice rougher than he intended. Lila closed her notebook, slipping it quietly into her bag. It was nothing, but Daniel knew it wasn't nothing. He had seen the way Emma clung to her, the way Lila's calm had transformed fear into laughter. And though he didn't say it aloud, something shifted in him that night. For the first time, he wondered if the stranger in his home wasn't a burden to guard against, but a light they needed. The rain had thinned to a drizzle by morning, leaving the apartment complex smelling of damp earth and rusted pipes. Daniel trudged down to the row of mailboxes, his jacket collar turned up against the chill. Most days, the mail was the same. Bills, advertisements, the occasional reminder that something was always due. Today, though, one envelope caught his eye. Cream-colored, heavier than the rest, its edges crisp. The return address printed in elegant serif type. Harrington and Cole, attorneys at law. His brow furrowed as he turned it over, reading the name typed neatly in bold black ink. Miss Lila Harrington. Harrington. The name rolled uneasily in his mind. It didn't match the image of the soft-spoken girl renting his spare room, the one who counted coins at the grocery store and wore the same 2 pairs of shoes. Law firms didn't send letters to struggling students in worn sweaters. For a moment, Daniel stood still in the shadow of the mailbox row, the letter heavy in his hand. 1,000 questions pressed forward. Who exactly was Lila? Why had she come here? Why hide behind the small, ordinary walls of his apartment? It would have been easy to tear it open, just a slip of the thumb under the seal. He could justify it: tenant safety, curiosity, a father's need to protect his child. The temptation itched at him like a splinter. But Daniel wasn't a man who pried. Dignity mattered more than answers. His wife had once told him, "Trust is built in silence, not in searching." That memory steadied him now. With a tight breath, he slid the envelope onto the little table by the door, untouched. Later that evening, when Lila returned from class, she noticed it immediately. Her step faltered as she reached for the envelope, her fingers brushing the edge. Her face betrayed the faintest flicker of tension. Jaw tightening, eyes widening for a heartbeat before she smoothed her expression back into calm. Daniel said nothing. He only nodded toward it. Came in the mail. Lila's hand hovered over the letter, but she didn't open it. Instead, she tucked it carefully into her notebook, as though placing it behind locked doors. "Thank you," she murmured. There was no confrontation, no questions asked, but the silence between them had changed. Lila looked at him with something unspoken. Respect, perhaps, for his restraint. That night, as Daniel sat by the small kitchen table sorting through bills, he found his mind circling back to that envelope. Harrington, a name that didn't belong to the world of leaky faucets and overdue rent. A name that hinted at rooms far larger, colder, and richer than his own. He didn't know it yet, but the unopened letter was the first crack in the mask Lila wore. And sometimes, Daniel thought as he exhaled into the quiet, secrets reveal themselves not in what is said, but in what is left untouched. The elevator doors opened with a metallic sigh, spilling Daniel into the marble brightness of Harrington Tower. He carried his worn toolbox in one hand, a work order in the other. Leaky pipes on the 32nd floor. It was the kind of job he'd done 1,000 times. Invisible work in glass castles that never belonged to him. The receptionist barely looked up as she pointed him toward the boardroom wing. His boots echoed against polished floors, out of place among the leather shoes and whispered conversations of suits. Daniel kept his head low. His world narrowed to the brass handle of the door he was meant to fix behind. But when he stepped into the boardroom, his breath caught. The room was all glass and steel, overlooking the sprawl of the city below. Around a long table sat men and women in tailored suits, portfolios open, their pens poised. At the head, framed by the skyline itself, sat Lila. Her hair, loose around her shoulders, caught the morning light. Her voice, calm but assured, filled the space as she finished a sentence Daniel couldn't process. An advisor leaned in close to her, nodding as though she carried decades of authority, not just 20 years of life. Daniel froze in the doorway, his toolbox heavy in his hand. For a heartbeat, he thought he must be mistaken. But then her eyes found him, and in that instant, the air shifted. Silence fell across the table. Advisors turned, puzzled at the interruption. Lila did not flinch. Her gaze held Daniel's, steady, unreadable. The quiet girl with the worn suitcase now cloaked in the undeniable aura of power. Memories rushed through him. Coins laid carefully on the grocery counter, whispered gossip outside his door, Emma's laughter during a thunderstorm. All the small cruelties she had endured, all the assumptions he had made. And here she was, not fragile, not powerless, but heir to the very tower he stood inside. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, breaking the silence. "Not Daniel, not sir. Mr. Carter." Respect layered in formality. "It seems we've met again." The advisors looked from her to him, confusion flickering. Daniel's throat tightened. He wanted to speak, to apologize, to demand an explanation. But the words lodged deep, caught between disbelief and humility. I didn't know," he managed, his voice rough, too loud in the pristine room. Lila tilted her head, almost smiling, though her eyes carried something deeper. A plea for him not to look at her differently. "You weren't meant to," she replied. Her tone was calm, steady, but underneath lay the quiet ache of someone who had chosen invisibility, only to be exposed. For a long moment, neither moved. The glass walls seemed to hold their silence like a fragile sculpture. Daniel stood in his faded work jacket, water-stained and heavy. Lila sat surrounded by wealth and authority, yet smaller somehow, as if stripped bare by his presence. Finally, one of the advisors cleared his throat, eager to resume. "Miss Harrington, shall we?" Lila raised a hand, dismissing him with gentle authority. Her gaze never left Daniel. "We'll continue shortly." The meeting broke in murmurs and shuffling papers. But Daniel couldn't move. His hand tightened on the handle of his toolbox, as if anchoring him to the life he knew. She rose from her chair, walked toward him, every step deliberate. And when she stood close enough for only him to hear, she whispered, "I didn't come to your home as a Harrington. I came as Lila, and I hope you'll remember me that way." Daniel swallowed hard, his chest thick with something he couldn't name. For the first time, he saw not just the billionaire's daughter, but the girl who had laughed with Emma by candlelight, who had endured gossip with quiet grace, who had lived among them not as heiress, but as human. The toolbox slipped slightly in his grasp. "I will," he said, and with those words, the truth between them shifted. No longer hidden, no longer ordinary, but fragile, shared, and undeniable. By the following week, the neighborhood whispers had changed their tune. The same neighbors who once clucked their tongues at Daniel's door now carried folded newspapers under their arms, Lila's face staring back at them from glossy headlines. Heiress of Harrington fortune seen overseeing philanthropic projects. At the corner store, Mrs. Caldwell, the one who had once warned Daniel about letting strangers in, stopped him in the aisle, her smile too wide, her tone too sweet. "Well, imagine that. Such a lovely girl, that tenant of yours. You must be so proud to know her." Daniel only nodded politely, not unkind, but without playing their game. Pride wasn't his to claim. Respect was, and he had already given her that long before the papers did. At home, Emma ran into Lila's arms as though nothing had changed, and in truth, nothing had. Daniel noticed the way Lila bent low, whispering promises of dreams and futures into his daughter's ear. A week later, an envelope arrived. Not heavy with law firms this time, but with possibility. A scholarship for Emma, signed discreetly with Lila's name, no publicity attached. Daniel read the letter twice, then looked at Lila across the kitchen table. She only smiled faintly and shrugged, as if it were nothing. For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt a weight lift. Not because of money or power or names in print, but because kindness, quiet, steady, and unseen, had answered every whisper of doubt. And that kind of justice, Daniel thought, was worth more than any headline. Daniel sat at the table long after Emma had gone to bed. The scholarship letter spread open before him. His pride warred with memory. Nights of unpaid bills, dinners of silence, the echo of his daughter asking for more than he could give. Was accepting help a weakness? Or was it, perhaps, another kind of strength? The sound of Emma's laughter carried from her room, soft and unburdened. In that moment, the answer was clear. Daniel folded the letter carefully, a quiet decision in his chest. Dignity wasn't refusing kindness. It was knowing when to accept it. The sun dipped low as Daniel, Lila, and Emma wandered through the community garden, laughter weaving between rows of flowers. The narrator's voice lingered. "Some rooms we rent change nothing. Some open doors to the truth of who we are." Emma slipped her hand into Lila's. Family, chosen and unexpected. They paused at the garden's edge, evening light painting the sky in gold. Daniel watched Emma skip ahead, her laughter rising like a promise. Lila stood beside him, the breeze tugging gently at her hair, her eyes carrying both the weight of secrets and the freedom of truth. She turned, her voice barely above a breath, yet certain enough to stay forever. "I rented a room, but found a home." Daniel didn't answer, not with words, only with the quiet nod of a man who understood. Sometimes family isn't given, it's discovered.